Hello, welcome to my video, and here I'm going to show you the game between Viktor Erdos and Alireza Firouzja from European Team Championship. It was the match between Hungary and France. It was this variation, the two knights. Markus Rager tried something similar with white. You can check out this game in my playlist. Alireza played bishop g4, which is usually played, and now h3. Firouzja took on f3 because bishop h5 could be potentially risky because of some ideas like g4, bishop g6, and after this bishop b5, knight c6 and knight e5, which can lead to some complications because of h4, h5 ideas. Let's say if you go rook c8, I might go first for d4 and then h4, h5 to provoke f6 at some point, because f6 leads to weakening the structure, but this is also not so bad for black as it may seem. White has to castle on the queen side, and black already knows that, because the g4 is the good indicator that white is going to castle on the queen side, and white is not so flexible because of that. But let's go back to the game. In the game, bishop takes f3 was played, which was a more solid approach. Queen takes, and now e6. White can continue with d3 or d4 or even g3, but here Erdos played d4. Although there are some ideas like going for d3 and playing it more slowly. Finish developing by d3, maybe even g3 or g4 even, and then later on to launch some offensive on the king side. Let's say if knight d7 to go bishop d2, and in case of knight f6 to go g4, and maybe next to go queen g3, f4, and with options of castling on both sides. He played d4, and now Firouzja plays knight f6. Just develops, and he's not afraid of e5, which would be a relief for black, because after this the c5 comes next, and I think that after c5, white center is just going to vanish. It looks like French, but black gave up the bishop, plus the queen on f3 interferes with f4, which would destabilize the center, but in this case, white doesn't have time for that, to move the queen to play f4 and go bishop e3, which would be the perfect version. Here it's much more difficult to do that. So after this, there is also an interesting option of giving the pawn d4 by playing bishop d3. If black wants to be principled, he can take on e4, and after this to take on d4. And now it becomes interesting because white can sacrifice the second pawn by playing bishop e3. Being greedy here for black doesn't work out that well, because after queen takes b2, white castles and goes rook b1 next, and it simply doesn't work out. If black tries something like this and to offer trade, now white just avoids it by queen g3. If knight d7 to finish somehow this development, you can go rook b1, and white has a full compensation for two pawns, and actually he's going to capture one of them on the next move, because if you go rook b8, there is bishop c6 for white, and white wins one pawn. If you go knight c5, there is this nice move. Rook takes b7, and you cannot capture back because of bishop c6, and black's king is just in too much danger. After king e7, you get checkmated. After king d8, you can just take and take the rook on the next move. So grabbing the pawn is not the smartest idea after bishop e3. Black should be satisfied with only one pawn, and he can go bishop b4, and after, let's say, king e2, because c3 is impossible due to bishop on d3, which hangs, and now you can go back. But still, white's position is slightly more pleasant, because now you cannot castle, really. You have to be careful as black. You cannot castle because of capture, capture, and bishop g5. If you do this, then rook a b1, and black's pieces are so tangled together that it's not gonna end up well. After this, queen h4, and you have dual threat of queen h7 and queen takes b4. Rook takes b4, sorry. So black still has to be careful after this, and he can do it by capturing on e4, bishop e4, castles, and still there is some compensation due to bishop pair and missing pieces from the king side, from the defensive side. But Erdos doesn't play e5, he plays ed5, which was much more solid. And now ed5 doesn't make much sense because it opens up the e-file and the bishop pair might come to its fullest potential. Bishop d3, bishop g5, castle even on the queen side. With cd5, Alireza keeps the position somewhat closed. White has a semi-open e-file, but black also has a semi-open c-file, so it's not entirely open position, which Firouzja wants, because white has a bishop pair. Now Erdos continues with bishop d3, knight c6, and now it's time to reroute the knight to support the pawn on d4 by pushing c3 next. Now Alireza plays h6, c3, and now bishop d6. The last piece comes into play. Now bishop c2. I would say this is a semi-waiting move. Waiting for black to castle, because after castling, black might end up in some trouble after g4. And then g5 opening up the king side. So after bishop c2, black tries to be flexible by rook c8. And now g4. On the other side, white is not so flexible, his intentions are very clear, and now black cannot castle into this kingside offensive, it will be just too crazy. Here Firouzja played king d7, he's going for the artificial castle, which is a very interesting idea. Also a very interesting move was e5, to meet flank operation with the central strike. If g5 was played, in that case you take, and take on d4, now using the bishop on c2. Which is loose, and if you take, at the first glance the king seems a bit open, but also white's king is in plenty of danger himself. If he castles now, it becomes crazy, a very sharp position. After dc3, rook he1, king f8, and the position is just so messy that I would just stop here and let you come to conclusions. But here king d7 was played, very interesting. g5 by Erdos, and now we had this. Black's pawn structure is still better. Now h3 pawn is a weakness, but there is a potential danger of putting pressure on the g-file. The danger of doubling the f pawns. And by that, the h pawn would be the passed pawn. Now Firouzja continues his plan to get his king to safety by king c7, king b8. Now Erdos castles, and now Firouzja castles. And rook dg1. Now white is trying to put pressure on the g-file, like I said. Or at least to capture on f6 at some point and to put pressure on f7 by rook g7. This was the signal for Firouzja to start some countermeasures on the queen side, and he played b5. White wants to exploit the g-file, black wants to exploit the lack of pieces on the queen side and tries to create some weakness on the queen side by pushing b4 at some point. And the final goal of this attack is to induce some weaknesses, to create something, to create some target on the white's queen side. Erdos plays a3 first, and now a5 by Firouzja. He wants to deliver this minority attack by pushing b4, and now queen d3 was played by Erdos. I think it's slightly inaccurate because it doesn't keep pressure on the knight on f6, and by not making pressure on f6, the queen from d8 becomes free. So here I think maybe better was to just continue by h4, and then to go for some push h5, h6, and not to be afraid of b4, because in that case you can allow this, and actually capturing on a3 is not so good, because after this, yes, white got the pawn, but c3 pawn is defended quite well. White's rooks might switch to the queen side, because now the queen side is opened up and the king might be in some trouble. Grabbing this pawn might turn ugly for black. So yeah, here h4 seemed quite interesting. Of course, the line I showed you, it's not forced, but just shows you how it could turn out. He plays this, and This allows immediately queen b6. The queen can go to b6 because the knight on f6 is not attacked twice. Now white takes on f6 and g takes f6. And now the h-pawn is somewhat advantageous to white, but it's not so simple to advance this pawn because the bishop can always get to f8 and h6 to block it. This and bishop h6. So white has to attack the f7 pawn by playing this, and now queen b7 first. And now rook hg1. The h-pawn is tough to push, because in case you push the pawn, bishop f8, bishop h6 is a good blocking measure. And that's why Erdos played this, and this allowed b4. Now Firouzja has some action on the queen side, and a4 was the right move to play. It doesn't open up the queen side so much. Now Firouzja plays this, but I think that f5 was better because it doesn't allow rook h7 on the next move. So you have the same idea, bishop f8, bishop h6, and stopping the h-pawn plus improving the bishop. But after immediately this, rook h7 was played, and now bishop h6 and king d1. Now f5. Now black forces the trade of rooks. This is what Firouzja did. Rook h8 and now rook g3. Maybe this was the moment to go for knight c1, to go for knight b3, but maybe Erdos was not really happy about bishop takes c1 and king c1, having the potential weakness on the queen side, you know. But I think that actually this knight on c6 is not so good as it seems at first. White's not going to capture on b4 at any moment, and if you take on c3, I take with the pawn, and the knight is not able to come any closer. Also, black's pawn structure is not so flexible. By that I mean that he can never push e5 so easily, because f5 becomes a huge target in that case, and black has to really prepare any central pushes. So I think here knight c1 was the better choice to get somehow to b3 or c5. But he went for this, and now rook c8. And again, I think knight c1 was the good choice for white, but he went for king e1. He tried to evacuate to the king side. Now Firouzja takes on c3 and goes to e7. King f1 now, and king a7. And now Erdos goes for rook g1, and now queen a6. Alireza chose to go to an endgame to exchange queens. He could just keep the queens on the board by knight g6 or some other move and keep the game more complex. But he chose this safer approach. Now we had the exchange, and after this, king a7, keeping the b file opened, and now, naturally so, white closes the b file by bishop b5, and now the knight has to find the right way, and it goes to f6 and tries to get to e4. Now black chose this move, knight f6, and here he played rook d3, allowing knight e4 and further improvement by knight d6 and so on and so on. But actually here f3 was very interesting. It closes the third rank for the rook, but it's not clear how black can improve on this. If you go here, white goes rook g2, and I think that black's idea here should be that to just transfer the king to the king side to defend f7 to be able to move the bishop, to be able to exchange knights, because if you do it immediately, then there is an issue with rook g7 or something else. The king can go to d6 and e7, and the king can also enter on d3 or c2 just and keep it very solid. But after knight f6, white allowed knight e4. Now Firouzja plays knight e4, and now f3 is not so good, because after f3, knight d6, the bishop on b5 is going to be captured, and the a pawn will be a passed pawn. So Erdos makes space for his bishop by rook d1, and now Firouzja just takes on c3, enters this endgame with opposite color bishops, but his issue here is that his pawns are very, very vulnerable potentially. Imagine if one pawn drops, then all the pawns are quite shaky as well. So we had this exchange and bishop e8. Now white tries to generate counterplay against the kingside pawn on f7, rook c7, and also there is this h pawn. But it's probably better not to push this pawn because it will become a very easy target. Maybe it's best to keep it there and to just keep the king closer and get the bishop back to b5 maybe and try to hold this position. Because if you exchange rooks in this position, it should be a draw because of rather closed nature of position and also the nature of opposite color bishops ending. But with h4, the h-pawn becomes exposed. Now first Alireza tries to improve his king and we have a couple of more moves. Now h5, I think it's even worsening the situation because now black has a very clear path. His king can go to d8, e7 and finally to g5 and attack the pawn. But first Alireza plays bishop g7, although king d8, king e7 idea was also quite good. And now king e2 by Erdos. And now capturing on d4 is not so good. I think that's something that Alireza missed in the first place. After this, h6 can become quite annoying and followed by rook h1. White is 2 pawns down, but the h-pawn is, I guess, the enough compensation for 2 pawns. And that's why I think that keeping the bishop on h6 was better here, and to go king d8, king e7 and just improve his king to go to f6. And also the d4 pawn is a huge target because it's on the dark square, so it can be attacked by rook and the bishop, and it's only possible to defend it by rook and king. And with bishop g7 he lost some time for that. And after king e2, king d8, now check, king e7, now bishop b5 back. Bishop d4 is not so good because of before mentioned h6, and that's why black tries to take the control over the h-pawn by king f6, and now king d3, king g5, and now time to play rook a8. Once the h-pawn was taken under control, you have to defend the d4 pawn because that pawn is the heart of this position. And now we have trade of pawns, king takes h5, rook takes a5, and now king g4. Now black is heading towards f3 to collect the f2 pawn. And white's position is really, really dangerous here because the d4 pawn is so helpless, it needs the king to help it, and the f2 pawn becomes pretty much alone. And if you try king e3, there is always f4 or just rook c3 or just f4 and king f3 next. So rook a6 was played by Erdos, but now black captures this f2 pawn finally. It will capture it, not immediately, but at some point for sure. Now white is going to defend this pawn by rook c6, and using the fact that you cannot really exchange rooks here because it leads to an equal endgame, since there is also a pawn which is quite dangerous and black has to take care of it. After bishop f8, bishop e8 is possible, and after this there is bishop f7, and all these pawns are quite vulnerable. After this you can take it and take on d5. This is just a draw, I think. Firouzja just avoids the trade by rook b7, and now if white goes for the same idea of exchanging rooks by rook d6, rook d7, then black simply takes. And if rook d7, now it's different because now white lost one tempo on rook d6, rook d7, and that time was used by black's king captured on f2, and now we'll see why it doesn't work. If you compare it with this one, here bishop f6 led to this, and after this you take all these pawns and it's simply a draw. But in this position, after bishop f6 and bishop e8, f4, bishop f7, f3, bishop e6 and king g1, and now you don't have time for bishop takes d5 because of f2 and queening on the next move. So after king g1 you have to go bishop h3 or some other move, then you push, and after king e2 you take on d4 and you have this d pawn as black. After a5 there's bishop c5, and after a6 there is d4. If you go bishop f1 then d3 and you lose the bishop. You need to keep the bishop on the diagonal f1 h3. If you move the king from e2 then I promote and take the bishop, so that's also lost. So you can see the difference between two lines. So Erdos tries to hold on to the f2 pawn here and plays rook c2. And now bishop f6. Black maneuvers with bishop d8, bishop a5, trying to get to e1 eventually and capture this pawn. And also to, at the same time, to control the a pawn, which is the safest approach. You can also do it by h4, but bishop h4, bishop f2, but the a pawn becomes too dangerous in that case. Now rook b2, trying to get a5 to push this pawn, but now bishop d8 just stops this idea. Now rook c2 and bishop a5. Now all the counterplay is stopped, and white tries something, but it doesn't work. Now the f2 pawn is going to drop, and he tries this, but rook a7 is going to happen, and after this he lost the a4 pawn, and now the final mistake by white was rook takes d5, which was met by rook a3. Zwischenzug. White is losing the rook, and in this position Viktor Erdos resigned. Thank you so much for watching this. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section, and I'll see you soon.